Well, folks, as I warned you repeatedly, this is the chance to open up a bit of a conversation. What I'd like to do quickly is just to fire a question each at our panelists, picking up on their presentation, and then we'll hand over to you. Tony, you made a really interesting remark about the financial crisis and that, therefore, the stability in London being seen positively. I'm sure you would have added to that Arab Spring, unrest in various other countries, all kind of driving it. How much do you think London has become a kind of a wealth protection zone as opposed perhaps to a wealth creation zone? And is this the sort of thing that's driving our house prices?
Well, I think there's no doubt that for some people, for some affluent foreigners, some of them driven to protect money, I think some who recognise that there are aspects of London domestic property and, you know, lifestyle issues, as I've talked a lot about earlier on, which are attractive here. Both of those will, you know, and the other thing is a huge and growing middle class or affluent middle class in many countries in the world now, very large countries with very rapidly developing affluent middle classes. You know, parents who want to buy a flat for their their sort of student children to live in while they're at university, things that wouldn't have been thought of in the past, all of these. So there's several different drivers at once. And of course there is a debate about whether that competes with, or how far it competes with, the demands of a rising population in London. I mean, London's population is rising at the rate of 100,000 a year, which is very fast for an old city, a developed city. So there is clearly some competition at the margin. However, I would say this, I mean, you know, I think that a lot of the competition from overseas buyers, even if they are using London property as a safe haven, is going to be very concentrated in inner and central London. And the vast majority of London is outside that area. So, you know, I always say, is a rich foreigner buying a luscious house in Belgravia really radically competing with the price of a semi-detached house in Ilford? Well, you know, perhaps £1 or £2 on the price, but it's, you know, it's not a direct competition. So but perception is important, and perception can be reality. So I think there is a bit of a building pressure on politicians. But my own view is it has less to do with the numbers of overseas buyers coming to London, even if they are using London property as a safe haven, and more to do with an underlying lack of capacity to build housing to keep pace with the growing population. These are two largely unrelated phenomena that have just got pushed together because the rich international buyers can be seen as somehow causing a problem. Actually, the problem would be there even if there were no international buyers.
Thank you. Hyejin, I loved your talk. Two things in it. One, that we are all just scientific subjects in your global view. The other one is, if I ever do have to move out of London, I'm definitely going to employ your lawyer index and go to a city with very few lawyers in it. So I thought that was excellent. So we've got to have all sorts of zip curves for lawyers. How much of this, though, is predictive? We've got, the Lord Mayor made the point that, you know, we've now got 400 cities over 1 million really effectively in the last 100 years. And certainly when I've been traveling, China and other people tell me, you know, Brazil and India, you're just seeing all these cities springing up. Can people use this in some way to influence it, or are you just sort of passively observing these power laws?
That's an interesting point. So when we talk about, I would like to address the prediction power here first. When we talk about prediction, we have the scientists have a different idea of prediction than the engineering. So engineers more to do with precise prediction. What's the percent of the increase of the population of this area? What's the area next? It's more short term. It's more precise prediction they care about. Prediction in science is more to do with more overall, general conceptual prediction. One example is when we want to build a new city out there, we can now predict it will not work the way we would expect. So it's more like broad way of prediction. It's more like a we want to build, another example is we want to build second Silicon Valley. It wouldn't work the way it is because Silicon Valley requires a lot of infrastructure. So the science will provide this kind of idea. Bunch of programmer will not work well if you don't have bakeries, good bakeries, you don't have restaurants, you don't have lawyers. You need a lawyer's offices, you need a bakery, good bakeries, you need a good housings. So it all comes as a package. And also, you can't build the cities like very productive without any crime. So science will provide the idea that cities is a package. It goes with ugly and good together. So the science will provide this kind of conceptual overall big the prediction rather than what's the percent of the increase of the crime when in 10 years. So I think that's the answer.
Martin, your new diagrammatic approach to kind of burst deaths is fascinating, and I remember when we met last year and you were showing me just the insurance industry, it was a powerful diagrammatic representation. But as I was sitting there in the audience watching those numbers and thinking about how they were collected, I was beginning to get skeptical, not about you, but about the way in which these numbers are produced. What changes would you make to the sorts of data that you use as inputs to your model?
Well, thank you, Michael. As I said, all our work was predicated on the availability of firm-level data, which is not available from national statistics. So you can't use it or base it around official statistics. So the only way you could do that is if the government were to change its attitude around data and economic data and actually make it available. So the Interdepartmental Business Register, which is the nearest the government has of a census of businesses, is kept under lock and key, and you just cannot get access to it. So it's impossible using official statistics, and we've only been able to do it because we've invested over 25 years in building this data up, which originates from commercial data sources, Dun & Bradstreet, for example. So really, you need to be able to work at the level of the firm and look at that an economy as an ecosystem rather than as a monolith, which is merely assessed using official statistics.
So you would support the Lord Mayor's cri de coeur for open data?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, folks, a bit of a warm-up there. I'm going to try and brave the lights here. I think we're all going to come home with a suntan, which is great, great stuff. We'll start down here with the gentleman. I think it's a white shirt somewhere. There we go. I'll take 3 questions quickly. Could you do me a favor, though, please? Do identify who you are, any affiliation you might wish to make, and then do keep your comments brief. So,
yeah, I'm Paul Steeples. I'm from the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. I'm here for just a private capacity this afternoon. I'm on holiday, so I'm geeky as that. This is building on your question to Hyejin, and Tony might have some comments on it as well, is where you take these figures and try and apply them to policy. I remember years ago we did some work with the Treasury about looking at what were the characteristics of successful regions, and it was decided that successful regions had a high proportion of companies in business services. And the question therefore was this a cause of them being successful or a consequence of them being successful? And when you think of what they are, if they're accountants and people like that, they're actually going to be where things are successful and you need accountants. So just piling in business support companies into the Northeast is not going to make the Northeast more successful. So I just wondered how you can take the very valuable work that seems to be done and actually turn it into some sort of policy things you can use.
Right. And up here, Lauren, just at the very front. While we're waiting, I think it's like that comment about sticking all those windmills up in the Northeast. We'll put all the lawyers up there as well and solve your problem. Anyway.
Thanks, Laura. Debbie Ounstead, Mercer's company. What, if any, evidence is there that particular governance structures and particular public policy interventions can influence the sustainability of cities?
Great. And Lauren's question up there. halfway up on the right. Can you stick your hand up if you want to grab the mic? Thank you.
Paul Shari, this doesn't fit in terribly well with the other two questions, but it was mentioned quite early on that the tendency is for cities to grow, more people to move into the cities. I think it's probably to be concluded from that within any country, you will tend to get, therefore, bigger cities, not necessarily more cities. It was mentioned, I think, by the Lord Mayor that some people who augment the population of the City of London travel from Dorset. Now, I wonder what thoughts anyone has of the future of this trend, bearing in mind concerns over the environment, the use of energy, people complaining about train fares, and in my view, frankly, people who travel that distance ought to pay an environmental harm tax. I just wonder what the thought is about that, the consequences of that trend.
Thank you. And I'll try and squeeze one more in if I can see a hand. Just there in the middle, Lauren. Yes, keep your hand. I was sitting there thinking about Laura's presentation, and I realized that actually the City of London's data problem is going to disappear, and that's simply because I want to move into the healthiest place in all of the UK to live, where there are no deaths. So so we'll all be piling in, and then she'll get all the data she likes. There.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden, looking at the financing consequences for cities, is there scope for looking at collaboration between megacities globally? We're seeing this gigantic increase in the power of megacities. Where's the financing risk being handled on all of that? And is there scope politically for collaboration between cities, or is it competition?
Okay. Well, panelists, there's 4 comments to get into policy, or people actually applying this, very much about this move into cities and then opportunities for financing, collaboration on finance. Hyejin, can I ask you to probably pick up on certainly on the move into cities and the first question about policy?
Oh, I was going to ask.
Okay, well, you can answer what you'd like to answer.
Okay, let me just clear first. I would like to just comment on the migration a bit, because I've been looking at the migration a slightly bit, and I've been working on the urbanization, why people get together in the cities and it gets larger and larger. We know that in the larger cities, when cities get larger, it's more productive. So, and the cities, inside of cities is ecosystem. It's coming back to the question. Inside of cities is ecosystem, but cities itself cannot live alone. So it is connected to other cities. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's cities become greater at expense to others, because it's just co-evolution. In the larger city, they have their own benefit for companies, for firms, or establishments. And then compared to small cities, and small city they have their own profit out of this co-evolutions. And cities get bigger and bigger by mostly by migration. And coming back to the question of energy consumption, so Ed Glazer is the economist in Harvard University, has put this way: it's actually better for environment to have bigger cities, because people usually we live in an outdoor, especially in America, the suburban area, like out of nowhere. Actually, it destroyed the environment surrounding us. Humans are not really environmentally friendly, so it's actually better for us, or the Earth in general, to have a larger city, fewer larger city, getting together, clumped together. Like New York, where New York is the lowest energy consumption in U.S. The transportation, the energy consumption, so energy consumption in the transportation sector is 1/3 of the total energy consumption, about more or less. And transportation sector in New York is the lowest energy consumption in US because they used, more than 30% of people used public transportation rather than using car-based commuting. Yeah.
Tony, some thoughts?
Well, I mean, on the, we've inevitably this afternoon and rightly sort of looked at London and the world and other mega cities, and I'll come back to that. But, I mean, it is also true, and the Centre, Laura Davidson showed some figures and statistics from the Centre for Cities, who do excellent work on, British cities, including London. And you'll know that Paul, the question of what it is about the other cities and regions in the United Kingdom, many of which have lagged growth in London and the South East, and particularly if you look at the whole of the South East, sort of greater London, greater South East, that London has grown faster, or the London region has grown faster for decades, and it has proved a really challenging problem. And I'm not sure much of the research, if I'm honest, I have to be careful, that people have done entirely gets round the predicting versus a lagging measure problem. If we have lots of successful people in a big and growing city, then the measures we measure there are showing success. The question of quite what you do about that to prop up or improve cities whose economy, or towns or medium-sized cities which are still declining, it's not clear. I mean, and I'm not sure we do know really. And you can see that whilst some of the initiatives of successive governments around the UK have kindled back into significantly successful life the inner and downtown areas of, let's say, Manchester being the most obvious example, there's still a lot to do in most of the other cities, and quite a lot to do in outer London, actually. There are bits of outer London that have got very good public transport and many of the advantages of the rest of London, but which, frankly, are not very economically successful. So, still a great deal. So I think a question about whether we measure things that are lagging whether they're lagging indicators or predictive is a very interesting one. I think governance clearly matters. Governance and public policy matters. But it's affected by the previous discussion, of course. That is that policy makers are often attempting to promote and improve parts of cities or whole cities without really knowing what works. I have colleagues who think it's all about skills. They think it's all about individuals' skills. But it wasn't so long ago that we thought it was all about opera houses and the night economy. Well, it might be a bit of both, but I think that the skills argument for the individuals is pretty convincing to me. That is, if everybody in Britain has high-level skill, then the high-level skills, they're going to get jobs and the economy will work better than if they don't. So I think, there's much to be debated there. I could go on. I am going on, really. And the point that we've just heard about big cities clearly are efficient in terms of, and London clearly has low car use, high public transport use, therefore low energy use. They are efficient. But, we're always up against the fact that in Britain, there are cultural pressures against city life. Everybody in this room may like cities, but, there are lots of people who, and it cuts across all class and background, the rectory in the countryside, sort of charmed country life, the quiet. Lots of people want that, which is why they travel to Dorset and Bath Spa to and from every day, which I agree seems bonkers to me, but people do it. I think that, and whether big cities can collaborate. Well, as I hinted, I think they are collaborative as well as competitive. Not sure they can really be collaborative in terms of financing major projects, but I do think they can be collaborative in telling each other what works to make life and the operation of them better within them.
Thank you, Tony.
I think from my perspective, looking at successful regions, it's about specialisation. And to go back to sort of a topic which is now quite unpopular, this notion of business clusters. Certainly where clusters have been effective and have been appropriate in terms of economic cycles, those areas have done quite well. And certainly the rise of the creative and cultural industries have gone hand in hand with Manchester's Renaissance. And finance has been the industry of the last 30 years, and coincidentally, the city has done very well out of it. So I'd suggest it's something to do with specialisation, but again, times change, and certainly the Northeast has lost out as economies and industries have moved on.
Let's get some more comments and questions, and so I'll try and get back up there. Can we start with the gentleman up here, please? Linda in the blue jumper. Again, do say where you're from, any affiliation, quick questions.
So, David Lutton from London First, Business Members Organisation. It's a question about productivity and population. So there seems to be this strong correlation between population and productivity. And I've seen research before that suggests that all the growth, or a lot of the growth, has not necessarily come from the megacities, but for the cities that are over about 4 million, that they have the strongest growth potential going forward. And coming back to the point about the other cities in the UK outside of London, are we kind of saying there's an optimum population size for a city to be productive? And what if your city, I mean, Britain doesn't have any other cities at 4 million population. So what does that mean for the core cities long term?
Thank you. Hands up, just there, Linda.
Hi, we've heard very eloquently this afternoon about the economies of scale and synergies of cities. A similar story can be said about economies of scale and synergy within the corporate world and the development of large corporates, globalization. And I guess this really is a question going back to Martin's analysis. He was talking about looking at migration within firms. But as we've seen with the debate on taxation almost, it is actually very difficult to understand where firms make their money, what the real core areas are. So in terms of the analysis you're doing, is it really based upon, I mean, A, how do you do that? And B, are you just really reverting to looking at premises perhaps, and which might be a misleading measure? So I guess my question is, do we not really need to take account of just the globalization in firms as well? And can we actually draw that down to a city-based measure?
Okay. And then if we could, Linda, if you could go up the middle, there's two gentlemen up there on the left.
Anthony Barnard, retired management consultant, member of the Gresham Society. The Lord Mayor mentioned a vast disparity between Hong Kong and our planning period. As I left Yalding this morning, the floodwaters were rising again. These are occurring more likely by the unfettered growth of commercialisation of the floodplains rather than global warming. In the press recently, we heard about the suggestion that we should have some new garden cities. Top of the list was Yalding, which is in the middle of a floodplain. Sorry to drag it out a little bit, but what I'm trying to point out is that I think we have an almost totally dysfunctional planning system, and I wonder what effect that you feel this has on the development of our country.
Thanks. Ian Potts, and I probably ought to admit I'm a member of the Planning Committee of the London Borough of Ealing. But, I mean, the question I want to raise, and I think really is Dr. Youn might want to take it first, is what is a city? I mean, we could have, we talk about how big London is. Are we talking about from Upminster to Uxbridge? Or are we going to talk about Shenfield to Maidenhead when Crossrail goes through? And someone said there we're another megacity in England, Britain. Well, what about that large conglomeration takes from Hoylake to Hoyle? Or for those who don't come from the north, that's Merseyside and Greater Manchester. They actually join up one another. You can go from the edge of Wales right up to the Pennines without leaving a built-up area. Now, how do we decide what a city is? We used to talk about the City of London, then we talked about the London County Council, so now we talk about the Greater London Authority, and I'm suggesting we might have to talk about the Crossrail area.
Okay. I think we'll try and squeeze two more in then, if I can. We'll come down to the front if we might. So The gentleman here, and then the gentleman in the corner.
Hi, I'm Don Leslie, and I run a recruitment business here in London. We haven't heard much about immigration, but we know that London has thrived through waves of immigration. What's our government's current policy going to mean for the future of London?
Thank you.
Thank you. John Youn, I teach in a sixth form college, and my question's about high-speed rail. HS2, those who favour it, if I'm not mistaken, believe it will stimulate the north, but there are others who say actually it will work the other way round. And reflecting upon the fact it's now over 30 years since Paris and Lyon were connected with a two-hour line. I just wondered, what does the panel feel about such high-speed rail links and their implications? Is it going to stimulate those cities which are already big, or is it going to stimulate those which are smaller? Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. So productivity and optimum population, economies of scale and globalization, planning, definition of a city, immigration policy and what it means in HS2, well, other high-speed. It's kind of funny, my brother sent me an email a few weeks ago in anticipation of this, and he said, you can see how terrible things are in London, and somebody in America had overlaid a map of Greater Tokyo on a map of the UK, centered on London. But very strangely, this overlay had kind of arrows showing that London is insignificant compared with Tokyo. And I looked at it, and I went to one of these radio websites, and I drew the same radius of Tokyo. And of course, Southeast UK has about the same population as the area contained within Greater Tokyo. It's interesting how these analyses are all over the houses. So this American's conclusion was that, London was insignificant when actually he should have been comparing it with the Southeast. Anyway, I think we'll start, if we could, again with you, Hyejin, and then perhaps Martin, shake it up a bit, and then Tony. Go ahead.
Before we start, I just have a comment of your remark. It's nice to have some discussion on this. So on the specialization, I think recently the Ricardo Hausmann, the economist in Harvard University, who actually remarks on the specialization. So basically, the idea of a specialization, we thought about cities as successness of the cities comes from specialization. And some part it is true, but as I talked about it all comes with diversity. So he remarked in this way. So people actually specialize themselves to increase productivity. And firms also specialize themselves to increase their productivity. But cities actually diversify themselves to increase their productivity, and countries as well. So when we talk about specialization and diversity, we have to actually understand what's the level of quantities or level of size we are talking about. So I just want to remark on that, optimal size of the cities, I think optimal. So here we are talking, when I talk about the scaling, the scaling, actually, the theory of scale doesn't have, it's like a theory of scale, doesn't have any scale. That means doesn't have any optimal, the underlying idea of scale is that there is no optimal size of the cities. Of course, this theory doesn't take into account any psychological, our happiness. It only takes care about what we measure. Based on what we measure, we find no scale of the optimality. And also, the optimal size is a function of innovation or technological capability. So if in the past, it's connecting to my talk, like cities, if you have a city, a bunch of people get together, then we create problems. We get together, we have a disease. Because of density, we have the sewage problem, we have all this water problem. Then we come up with the idea of the sewage system, we come up with the idea of public transportation, highways, and elevator to have a large, high building. So when we talk about optimal size, we have to take into account innovation we may or may not be able to have. The solution to this problem. So I can't answer to your question, but I just give you some background on how you can think about optimal size. Now come back to the question of the boundary issue. Yes, it's very hard to define what you mean by city and what's the boundary. And depending on the boundary you draw, your index may have different implications. So the boundary I'm drawing, or boundary we like scientists usually use, are metropolitan statistical area. This includes the inside of the city where all the business, economic activities, and idea, social mixing come in. And then we extend the larger area, which also includes suburb, where people commute. Laura actually showed some slides. In the day, you have a population peak in the center of the city, and then night, you have the people go back to home, and you have the population change, the distribution population change. So in science, we try to think cities as an entity. It's a kind of closed boundary. Of course, nowadays, especially UK, doesn't have much of the closed boundary. But in US, we have better definition because there is no, out of nowhere in Nevada, like Las Vegas, you don't see anything outside of cities. And even New York, there is emptiness in the middle of big cities. So it's very easy to define these cities. That's why we see better zip flow in US than UK. UK is more complicated, as you said. The commuting areas is all clumped together, so commuting areas are mixed, and it's been hard to define what's the boundary. But there have been some work, Michael Battis group in UCL, CASA, they try to define the metropolitan area equivalent to US metropolitan area in UK system, and they find, given this like scientific or method, they find the result of UK actually are very similar to US in some way when you define the metropolitan area differently from the just nominal city of boundary or some administrative boundaries. So that's what we do right now.
Yeah, I think this is one of those rich questions which is tough on a panel. In preparation for this, I did a bit of just updating. I used to work in the 70s on the U.S. standard metropolitan statistical areas, so the creation of those at that time. I think about 120 or so, something, or 116. And they're very confusing. And then there's a distinction between single economic centers and multi-cluster centers, and you get these things of huge bits. The other thing I found, which was fascinating, was what is the largest formal city in the world, and it's Ulaanbaatar in Manchuria, which is approximately the size of England, maybe a bit larger. And the other one was was Calgary, Waterloo or something in Australia, which is this long, thin, what I might call a gargantuan empty county of 30,000 people. But I think that is the second largest city in the world. So, it's what you make of it. But whatever it is, it's not the city limits, that's for sure. Martin?
Well, absolutely. Picking up on that, from the perspective of our work, we tend to look at activity areas and activity densities. So we would, if we're looking at a sector or a business cluster, we'd try and understand what activity is going on and actually draw a boundary around the area of high density. So we would be primarily concerned with what's actually going on, and then just draw the boundary to suit. And I think coming back to this notion of why firms move, especially within a globalized economy, I think we need to split out international migration and domestic migration. Obviously, on an international basis, there'll be a multiple of factors. It may be around tax, it may be about accessing a particular market. Whereas domestically, firms will relocate it's unlikely to be much about tax because there's very little variation available in terms of tax, but it's much more likely to be about access to markets and access to labour and skills. So again, one of the things that we're actually doing at the moment is speaking to firms which have moved to understand their motivations, and also asking what were your expectations prior to the move, what was your decision making, and has that actually turned out in practice? Did you get access to those markets that you thought you would do by moving location? So at the end of the day, that takes plain straight asking companies and what their motivations are.
Right. Well, the as Michael said, the question of what is a city is such a rich one that hundreds of days of conference could be spent on it. Indeed, there's a lovely piece in the Evening Standard this evening about some people who live in TW3, one of the Twickenham postal districts, who want to get in, TW2, who want to get into TW3. This is because they are in the borough of Richmond, but they're trapped with what they see as a Hounslow postcode. So you can see that they think this you'll see it damages their house prices and terrible. So, when people are worried about whether they live in TW2 or TW3, the question of what the public thinks London is, as compared with what my dear economic geographer colleagues think, still less statisticians think London is an interesting one. Actually, I think we've been aided and abetted, enormously aided here by these photographs of the world from space. I think the photographs of the world from space at night give us a very clear, common sense view of kind of what a conurbation is. Because in most cases, you can sort of see where, the amount of light reduces to nearly dark, and that gives you a sense. And it's not a million miles away, in fairness to the world of economic geographers and standard metropolitan areas, where in the end the density of population falls off. So I think that, London from space, Tokyo from space, Paris from space kind of is in many ways a help here. So I think with London, we're talking about a place of something between 10 and 12 million people in it, which is bigger than Greater London, but smaller than the Greater Southeast, which is London plus the Southeast and the East. But, hey, and there won't be any statistics easily to assess that anyway. The problem, I think, and I take the point about Merseyside and Greater Manchester, which, of course, the Redcliffe Maud Commission was going to put in a single urban metropolitan area called Selneck, South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire, which would have been a lovely acronym, wouldn't it? I think the difficulty there is, if you think about it, if I were operating a slightly different rule of thumb policy to work out whether you're talking about a single urban area or a collection of urban areas within an area, do they, it sounds a bit trite, but, would they think one opera house was enough? If you live in Southend or Southampton, you probably would go to the opera in London. If you were in Widnes, would you go to Liverpool or would you go to Manchester? That's the question, because each of them, for their good civic reasons, would like an opera house. So I think there's a difference between a single-centred urban area and a multi-centred metropolitan super area. And certainly in terms of the way they work. Planning policy, I think the difficulty with British planning policy is, I'm a big fan of democracy. There's too much democracy in it. To wit, we all want things we don't want. We want lots of houses, but no houses near us. And the planning system delivers that result perfectly. And we are to blame for that, not politicians, we are to blame for that. So I just think, and I can see how in Hong Kong it is easier to build airports, different culture, different political system, and so long as we allow democracy to infect the way we make decisions about things, people will want inconsistent things. And I do not blame politicians quite as much for that as they are often blamed. Immigration, well, I'm blaming them on the immigration policy. Politicians have feebly allowed themselves to be pushed into a position which is not in London's interest. I think immigration has been a profound benefit to London. Nobody can have an open immigration policy. Immigration's been a profound benefit to London for hundreds of years, particularly in the last 50 or 60. And it would be a tragedy if the London model and economy were undermined by ill-thought-through policies, frankly designed for a median rural voter who lives somewhere a long way away from London. And then High Speed 2. Thank you. High Speed 2, well, I mean, necessary but not sufficient. I'm agnostic about High Speed 2. I say that having been to Buckinghamshire, where I was talking about something else, and every single question was about High Speed 2. Bless. And indeed in Camden. But High Speed 2. The Victoria Line was built, it's 50 years, almost exactly, since the Victoria Line was opened. It hasn't done as much good for Seven Sisters and Black Horse Road as it has for Oxford Circus, and it's necessary but not sufficient. So if it's to do well for Birmingham and Manchester and Liverpool, which personally Leeds, which I sincerely hope it does when it opens, it will have to be backed up by policies near those stations to capitalise on the arrival of the railway, because the railway itself won't do it.
Absolutely, if I can add to that, it's not the railway that's going to pay for itself, it's what happens at either end. It's the activities that happen. So, Leeds has to have economic activity going on, which means the trains are packed.
Yeah, I'm reminded...
Black Horse Road will do well in future. I've just chaired a Waltham Forest Growth Commission, and I see Black Horse Road as the future, I should add, along with Tottenham Hale.
Yeah, there was a lovely Economist article looking at, we often forget that the first HS1, there were many predictions about what would happen to Ashford, which never really materialized. And I remember at British Rail, they were even predicting back in the late 80s that we could anticipate having people regularly commuting from France to come to the city for work, which never really featured in the end result. So that's it. The second thing is I ran into the delightful mayor of Croydon at a dinner a few weeks ago when you were there, Tony, and she was lamenting that Croydon has been trying to give an example to Twickenham. It's tried to go for city's charter status twice, as I recall, and been rejected. But maybe Twickenham would have a better stab at it. Anyway,
we did answer the 4 million. I know I've spoken too much. The 4 million cities point. Can I just add? I mean, what strikes me as interesting is because a lot of this, and Hyejin and Martin know more about this than I do, but clearly industrial change has profoundly affected the way our other big cities work. But actually, we have smaller cities. I listed 3 while I was thinking that I know reasonably well: Cambridge, Chester, and York, which work really well. So slightly smaller cities in Britain work really, really well. A combination of a university, well, actually Chester has a college, but a beautiful architecture and a nice affluent population. And in Cambridge's case, the world is its oyster. It's an incredible place.
Actually, an ad...
And Oxford, for that matter.
A brief advertisement on the long finance community, Tony. You'll find a whole area devoted to long decisions, which is how can we be democratic and yet actually adhere to decisions, the presumption being we're very good at making decisions, very, very good at it. We make decisions every day, it's just that they're different, so yeah. Great, well, we've got time for one more round from the audience. So Linda, you're very Lauren, could we start with the gentleman there? Linda, there's a woman down here, sort of second row.
Michael Harrison, I'm Master Marketeur. Actually, I must make one comment to the chairman. I understand why you made all your rude remarks about lawyers after the Lord Mayor is gone.
Well spotted.
But I should tell you that I'm seeing her in 27 minutes' time. A lot of good statistics, and then a comment that, in a sense, made my marketeur's hackles rise, because the then word was, but perception, of course, is everything. I totally agree. My question, therefore, and I'm sticking up for London, I'm not interested in the other cities, they can look after themselves. Or put it another way, I don't think that by reducing London's power, you're going to actually benefit the other cities. I think it's the other way around. Larger cities become more efficient and profitable, we've heard. What is the single greatest attribute that the City of London, and for that matter, London in general, should push from a marketing perspective so that the perception of London is enhanced to the greatest extent?
Let's shake it up. He says one attribute very quickly. Tony.
People, always. People, creativity of, diversity of, extraordinary capacity to get on. 8.5 million of them get on amazingly well. Very low violent crime rate in London. Huge creativity, people.
Mark?
Very difficult to disagree with that.
Hyejin?
That's right, the people. It's not about the building. Building important to bring good people, but people, yes. People and their interaction and their creativity.
The lady up here.
I was wondering if, for the physicist, I'm Katie Igris, I'm from Chicago, I went to the LSE, I did my undergrad in geography, and I work in finance. So I'm wondering if you used any other country with a different political system, a different, like you mentioned, Hong Kong, they built an airport. It took us a lot longer in London. In your data, have you looked at different times in history, the Soviet Union or North Korea, in different cities, different places? Is that something that you expect will be different elsewhere in different socioeconomic systems, not just the US because the data is available? Thanks. Oh, and I work for BNP Paribas. We're the #1 user of Eurostar. Lots of French people commute on a daily basis.
Very good. Just very quickly, we've got a few here.
All right, so Brian Clockelly at World Cities Network. My question is regarding, it kind of follows on the flood issue. So there are enormous issues that London face in terms of environmental challenges, social challenges, economic challenges. We almost ran out of water 18 months ago, for example. So there's a real need to harness our data and to understand how the city's evolving and changing. And I think one of the opportunities, possibly for the City of London, is to be the entity that can bring all this data together and make it available. And my question to the panelists really is that, how can we do this? Because we're not very good at sharing data. We're not very good at releasing data. And we're making very slow progress in terms of harnessing the data that's available. And I think what you've shown today is that there is a great amount of data there, and there's an enormous amount we can talk about. We can talk about this all day. But how can we possibly, what kind of entity can we trust that can collect the data, analyze the data, and make it available? How do we make that happen faster?
Thank you. Hand it just to your left there to Chris.
Hi. I've just taken an interest in Chinese welfare trust, so this is very much more slightly different from most of the other questions here, I suppose. In terms of tomorrow city as the main theme of the day, I was just wondering, what is the panel's view on the aging population that we are having at the moment, and how does it impact the city of tomorrow in that context?
Thank you.
On terms of welfare and the aging.
Just behind you, Chris. There's Chris behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hugh Simpson from Bose Consult. We're talking at a time when cities are clearly on the up, so it's tempting to think there's something inevitable and unchanging about that. But I was recently reviewing some literature on financial centres. It's not that long ago people were confidently saying that technology will make location unimportant. You can have a laptop, you can work anywhere in the world. I mean, they were wrong about the last 20 years, but is that a change that has only been postponed? I mean, are there things that would actually reverse the trend towards urbanization and make people think cities are not the place to be?
Great. And the last show of hands before we break. Hands up. Frank, up forward. Great. Last question then, or comment.
I'm Frank Cox from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, so you probably guessed my question here. With increased specialisation coming into London, you've done a jolly good PR job. How long is it going to be before our commuter from Dorset finds his nearest hospital is in St Pancras, is in London at Imperial College, or the one from Doncaster has to go to University College?
Okay. Great. Well, with the proviso from the master marketeur that all further comments about occupations will discuss plumbers. Plumbers. Okay. If we could, plumbers, terrible things, plumbers. So we had international, aging, technology being a reversal, university, and I'm sorry if the second one, I just can't even read my own handwriting. So data. That's right, data. That's right, sharing data. Super. Let's see, Martin, you haven't kicked off yet.
Well, data, yes, something that is very close to my heart, and I must admit I was really excited when Laura put that slide up about sick codes, because the sick code manual is my Bible. It just shows about my life. I think one of the real issues that we've got to address is, for the vast majority of people, data are boring. It's numbers. A lot of people have issues with number, and as a consequence, it doesn't really attract the public interest. Without the public interest, the politicians don't get involved, and there's no real leverage on making change happen. So I think it's about how can we repackage, how can we make statistics sound, sexy and interesting, and really address something. And there's also the old, lies, damn lies, and statistics. People are suspicious of numbers and don't really believe that they add a lot until they actually try and do something vaguely scientific, which does require numbers. So I think, we all have a duty here in terms of demanding better numbers. Asking our politicians for actual numbers. If they make a statement, say, you're saying those numbers, where's your evidence? Please give us the evidence. Where's this data come from? So I guess we can all do something about it.
Tony.
Right. Well, just adding on the data question, I'm fascinated by the parallel growth in the number and quantity of data, and there is a massive explosion of numbers about everything. But of course, that brings with it, and many of you, some of you, the insomniacs, may have seen a discussion on Newsnight last night involving Alain de Botton, who's written a book about the news and about the way we react to being endlessly bombarded by ever larger amounts of news, and does that desensitize us to news. And I think that, in a sense, there is always a risk that when you've got an infinite amount of something bombarding you, you eventually think this is too much to cope with. What intrigues me, therefore, is the way some of these data are used brilliantly, radically to improve our lives. But it's all completely random. So obviously great research. We've seen some of that from my two colleagues here this afternoon. And I do think academics and professional companies are good at doing this, and they're trusted to do it. But if I'm honest, the way that it influenced my city life most, it's individuals making apps out of TfL's data. Okay? I now know when not to go and wait for a bus. I now know things that do at the margin. Now, whether we can take all this vast quantity of data and I do think it's the existence of trusted intermediaries, be they academic, professional companies, kind of anybody other than government, dare I say it. And that's not that I'm in favour of government, well run. It's just that people don't trust it, but they do trust other institutions. So I think it's very much in the hand of intermediaries as to whether this bombardment of data works. On the question of other cultures, it's interesting. Almost every city in the world has a different government system. Chicago is different to New York and is from Los Angeles. They're all different from London, which is different to Paris, which is different to Tokyo. Chinese cities are evolving their own systems and so on. So not only are government systems different, but obviously cultural backgrounds are different. I'm all struck, Singapore, very interesting. Singapore, very different culture to Britain, with a city-state with one level of government. It's a kind of defining case of a different city, Singapore. It's a city that's a country, and it has one level of government with no lower tier. Now that jolly well ought to work. That is the ultimate simple city government. Whether it's perfect, I doubt. Nowhere's perfect. But I take your point exactly. Cultural attributes, history, and the systems of government that have accidentally evolved all affect the things we're discussing and at scale. Ageing population. London, of course, has the youngest population in the UK by far, a young city by the standards of almost any developed city in the world, older city in the world. However, that carries with it the implication that unless immigration and churn continues, it will eventually become the oldest, or one of the oldest cities in the world. About, let's do the maths, it's further away every week, but 68, 70 years from now, it will become a very old city. Now, quite how we handle that then, I don't know, but we're going to be dealing with floods before that or something, not to make light of it. And then, yes, one final word, technology in the end of city. I've always been intrigued by this point. You're absolutely right, Hugh, that in the 1960s and 70s, everybody thought the telephone would be it, wouldn't it? The telephone would allow you to retreat to Wales, trade stocks and shares on the phone, and cities would empty out. And it was very much with the spirit of cities which were emptying at the time, and cities were thought to be dead. Now, what I think probably undermines that, apart from the economics we've learned subsequently about agglomeration and clustering, which I still think is very important, is that in the end, social factors have overwhelmed all of this. That is, people like to, there are advantages to living near other human beings, all sorts of social advantages. But most importantly, powerful people can never feel powerful unless they're near other powerful people, and they need to be together. And for that reason, if no other, I picked this up from The Bonfire of the Vanities, novel, Tom Wolfe's novel of the early 80s, long predictive of the banking crisis, I might add, if you read it carefully. I just think that the fact that powerful people who tend to live in cities or like to have their lives enhanced, their self-image enhanced by glittering cities, like to be near other people like themselves, and for that reason they'll continue to cluster together with their businesses in cities.
So what was the question? I was fascinated by your talk, and then I lost my train. Data, yeah. Oh, right. Yes, thank you. Now I got my train. Yes. So first question, we talked about. I was mentioning like different countries has very similar behavior of the cities in US or UK. They share, actually, cities in the world share very similar characteristics in some statistics. But the difficult part, the two countries you mentioned, North Korea and some other countries that are economically undeveloped, it's very hard to get data. So now come back to the question. We can't see anything what's going on because we don't have consistent comparable data. That's why Martin just before mentioned that we used nightlight satellite image because we cannot see what's the economic activity of the North Korea or what's the economic activity in the other places. That's why we need to have some other proxy to measure. These are more consistent. There is a whole one journal just only for nightlight images. It's just a journal of remote censoring, kind of something like that. It's just not only one journal. It's just one journal I recognize. So it's a huge business out there because we want to know what's going on there and how we can help them grow or how we can understand ourselves better by looking at others. But we talk about big data. We talk about a lot of data out there. But no, actually, we lack of data a lot. Let's come back to the question of data here. The problem of the data is one of the slides here, we just measure what we can measure. We don't go for collecting really consistent, comparable data. And also, data are collected individually. Even if they are consistent, we don't mash up. We don't have a crosswalk. We don't have the map between how this person goes to work, in this long commute, the distance, and move to another cities and make this much money, better productivity. And we don't have this crosswalk, like connecting this data to that data for even one city or even one country. Even one, different countries, of course, different countries worse. So it's actually difficult. We talk about data a lot, but we lack of data. We don't have consistent data collector. That's because everyone wants to have their own repository. I realize people talk about data in my repository, not yours. So a lot of people talk about, there are individual governments and organizations talk about the consistent, gathering data, but nobody collaborate because they don't want to collaborate to share your data out there. And the collecting data requires a lot of money and attention. I mean, if you can collect the crappy data, but if you good data, it requires a lot of money and attention, manpower, resources. And one of the good initiative, I think, is the UN. UN recently takes a charge of this data, consistent comparative data for the urban area. So that's the one reliable source. But there are lots of practical issues rather than what we can do.
Well, I've sadly got to draw this conversation to a close. I'm struck by many things. I won't try and summarize it. I am impressed, though, that we stuck to the subject. It wasn't hard. It's such a deep subject. I hope the audience has gotten a flavor that even the leading professionals in the field are struggling with even the basics of defining. I gave a Gresham lecture a few years ago where I said if you wanted to look at two countries that were the same, imagine that you were a Martian and the only artificial thing you could see on Earth were the national boundaries. I think you'd pretty much agree that Britain and France were almost identical. That all roads and networks and lighting systems, everything just led to one bit. That's where all the powerful people did their Parkinson's law cocktail parties. This was it. I also wonder too, as we move up to 9 billion people, those space photos are basically going to be all filled in. And I wonder if our old analysis methods are going to almost go out the window. When we do the Global Financial Centers Index, the reason that it's very attractive, certainly one of the reasons I think it's very attractive, is people who manage cities see that finance is principally about policy. So if you change some policies, you can make some easy gains in ways that you can't in some manufacturing industries or what have you. And I think we're almost going, in a circular bit where we didn't perhaps spend as much time as we should have on governance, because we've got this national, local, city, county, all this. And your example, Hyejin, of your ZIP laws, where you were looking at the fact that it works except for the EU, which in some ways implies that the national boundaries in the EU are really still very, very strong. So I think that was also interesting. Anyway, Tony made me think about the zodiac of cities. Do I want the ethical Portland, the laid-back Brisbane, the tolerant and liberal Amsterdam? Martin's got me, thinking about, census and births and registries data. And Hyejin, I think, certainly inspired me in terms of there is possibility here for science, maybe to advance our predictive capacity and therefore our abilities to make better policies. Could I ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for their great...